First reading for today is from the Sermon on the Mount. Gospel according to Matthew chapter 5. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. The second reading is from St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, chapter 12. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends upon you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. No, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Our third reading is an article that appeared in the Atlantic online edition last month by Heather Ann Thompson, entitled, How Prisons Change the Balance of Power in America. Between 1970 and 2010, more people ended up in prison in this country than anywhere else in the world. At no other point in this nation's recorded past had the economic, social, and political institutions of a country become so bound up with the practice of punishment. By the year 2007, 1 in every 31 U.S. residents lived under some form of correctional supervision. By 2010, more than 7.3 million Americans had become entangled in the criminal justice system, and 2 million of them were actually locked up in state and federal prisons. By 2011, 39,709 people in Louisiana alone were living behind bars, and 71,579 were either in jail, on probation, or on parole. And this was by no means a southern phenomenon. In Pennsylvania, 51,638 people were actually locked behind bars in 2011, and a full 346,268 lived under some form of correctional control by that year. American Gulag. We honor today one of the towering figures of world history, a man born into a system of oppression so severe that the government's only reaction to his leadership was to put him in jail for 27 years. But I'm not going to talk about South Africa. I'm going to talk about the nation we live in, Nelson Mandela, who should know, said, "No one truly knows a nation until one has been inside its jails. A nation should not be judged by how it treats its highest citizens, but its lowest ones." We sit here in relative contentment at the elbow of Cape Cod's arm thrust into the ocean, and it seems like heaven on earth. We are religiously descended from Universalists, and we don't believe in a hell in the hereafter. But it is so easy to ignore the man-made hells that exist among us. They're mostly located in rural areas, far out of the public eye. However, real people are held there, and those people are disproportionately minority and poor. What is our imprisonment rate now? According to Wikipedia, the incarceration rate in the United States of America is the highest in the world today. As of 2009, the incarceration rate was 743 per 100,000 of national population. In comparison, Russia had the second highest at 577 per 100,000. Canada was 123rd in the world at 117 per 100,000. That's America at 743, Canada at 117, and China had 120 per 100,000. While Americans represent about 5% of the world's population, nearly 1/4 of the entire world's inmates have been incarcerated in the United States in recent years. Imprisonment of America's 2.3 million prisoners, costing $24,000 per inmate per year, and $5.1 billion in new prison construction, consumes $60.3 billion in budget expenditures. How did we get this way? What I'm going to give you this morning is my unscientific personal observation from my lifetime, half a lifetime as a criminal defense lawyer. I don't pretend to neutrality. A criminal defense lawyer occupies a peculiar place in the justice system and in American society. He or she is called on to do the best job possible for people the general public loves to hate, people the public considers the scum of the earth. You make your peace with the prison system early on, but you never stop caring. And day in and day out, you stand before the judge with the client you've worked with for months. And the judge pronounces sentence. And that client disappears into the prison system for years or years or years. Sometime later, you may be called on to go visit that client. And you will find yourself searched on going in and coming out. You will tense up when the steel doors clank shut behind you. And you will breathe easier when you're in your car, putting those brick buildings and the barbed wire behind you. But what factors have built up our prison system, our prison industrial complex, over these last decades of the 20th century and the first decades of the 21st? I would point first to racism. That great weight on our personal and political life infects every decision maker in the criminal justice system. From the cop on the beat, to the prosecutor, to the defense lawyer, to the judge, to the corrections officer, and the parole board. The prison system is the new Jim Crow. Beyond racism, there's long operated in this country a politics based on fear. Fear gets people's attention and therefore can be used to sell newspapers and ad revenues in TV stations. The local crime stories have always been a staple of the nightly news. If it bleeds, it leads. Turn it on tonight at 6 o'clock. You can bet that of the stories they cover, the first few will be local crime stories. This leads the average citizen to conclude that we're in the middle of a crime wave and gives that citizen the incentive to vote for politicians who promise to be tough on crime. Vote out those who want any kind of leniency for offenders. The article that I just referred to points out that in 1965, another factor entered the equation, the LEAA, Law Enforcement Assistance Act, a federal program that was the federal war on crime. It gave money to local and state police departments to buy their helicopters, beef up their personnel, and build more prisons. It has ballooned since 1965. Ironically, that was also the year of the passage of the Voting Rights Act, one of our great steps forward in human rights. One step forward, one step back. Shortly after the war on crime was inaugurated, we had the war on drugs. That also has resulted in a higher incarceration rate, and particularly incarceration of black males whose fondness for crack cocaine results in their imprisonment rate at a huge percentage higher than whites who prefer powder cocaine. Then people demanded truth in sentencing. It turned out that when the judge banged the gavel and said 10 years, often prisoners were getting out in 2 and 3 with good time credits and parole. This upset the certain elements of society enough where they demanded truth in sentencing, that prisoners serve most or all of their sentence, which is the case now, and that further burgeoned the prison population. And then a particular development in sentencing from the late 70s on was guideline sentencing. I'm standing here before you today as a minister because at some point in the mid-90s I had had enough of guidelines in the federal court. They allowed very little room for a criminal defense lawyer to do any good and put all the power in the hands of the prosecutors. The idea of the guidelines started with the Attica prison riots in 1971. And looking back at the reason for the riots, the commission found that sentencing disparities played a large part in the prison tension. In other words, what sentence you got sort of depended on how crowded the court system was that sentenced you. So if you committed an armed robbery in the Bronx, your case might be bargained down to a couple of years because the prosecutors there are under such pressure to move their cases. Whereas if you commit the same crime in Schenectady, you might end up with 20 years for it. So this was an injustice. And the idea of the Sentencing Commission was to level out the sentences for the same crime with a bunch of factors. It's a really amazing human endeavor to try to quantify evil on a table. But it took a lot of the art and a lot of the heart out of the sentencing process. It tends to demoralize the defense bar and the judges as well. So these are some of the factors feeding into the ballooning criminal prison system. But I want to step back for a minute. When we say criminal punishment, we mean anything that can be imposed as a result of a criminal conviction, including fines, disabilities, imprisonment, or execution. There are 4 recognized purposes of criminal punishment generally. The first is deterrence, which is based on the idea that the threat of punishment in the future keeps us from committing crimes in the present. The second is incapacitation. We lock up this offender to keep him or her from committing crimes now or during the period of that incarceration. The third is retribution, or just deserts. The idea that we hurt this offender simply because he or she has hurt another person. It is based on vengeance. The fourth purpose of criminal punishment is rehabilitation, to make the offender come to terms with the crime and refit him or herself to live in the society at large. The first three, retribution, incapacitation, and deterrence, are the heart of the American penal system today. Rehabilitation is almost forgotten. And there is another R word worth the mention here. Jesus favored reconciliation, not even getting into the system. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:25, he says, "Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny." This, by the way, is still good advice. We will return in a minute to the purpose of punishment, but first let us ask another question. We can see the human cost of our prison industrial complex in the broken families and broken lives and the enormous drain on the public purse. But what do we get for this cost? How effective is it? First, it should be said, it doesn't undo any of the crimes. It doesn't undo any of the harms done by any of the crimes to lock up the offenders. But does it actually work for deterrence? What has happened to the crime rate during this prison buildup? According to FBI statistics, the rate of violent crime per 100,000 population climbed steadily from 160 in 1960 to a peak in 1991 of 758. So 160 to 758 crimes per 100,000 population over the course of 30 years. After 1991, the rate descended until in 2012 it was 387, about the level it had been in 1971. The $64,000 question is, why? Criminologists will all tell you that the factors are multiple and complex. The crime rate decline may be due to deterrence. It may be due to building more prisons, more police on the beat, better police procedures. But it may be also due to simply the changing demographics. We know that the age bracket from 15 to 30 is much more likely to commit crimes than any other age bracket. And with the aging of the population, you get a natural reduction in crime. That's one reason why the crime rate in this area of Cape Cod is so low. But whatever happened to rehabilitation? Very few programs around today teach prisoners skills or prepare them for life on the outside. This, in my view, is very short-sighted. Most of the prisoners that we have in the system now will eventually be released. And it is in society's interest that they have a way to fit in. Now you may say, this is all well and good as political discussion, but what does it have to do with religion? I contend that it has a lot to do with two particular religions. Christianity, which is the focus of the season that we're in now, and more particularly its liberal offshoot, Universalism. Universalism affirmed in 1935 a belief in the, quote, supreme worth of every human personality, unquote. That is now enshrined in Unitarian Universalist values as our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. But think about that contrast from supreme worth to inherent worth. It sounds a little bit like it's taken a step down, but in fact it's taken a more broad step Because inherent worth is worth that is not defeasible, as lawyers would say, worth that cannot be taken away. If it's inherent, it's woven into the fabric of who the person is. And no amount of offense or conduct by the person can forfeit their inherent worth and dignity. In other words, Universalists believe that we were all God's children, that God did not create hell in the hereafter. Therefore, we should not create hells on earth just for the purpose of vengeance, just for the purpose of hurting the offender. I'll mention a few examples of early Universalists who took an interest in how we treat prisoners. Benjamin Rush, a Philadelphia physician and pal of Franklin and Jefferson, wrote a 1787 book, An Inquiry into the Effects of Public Punishment upon Criminals and upon Society, in which he stressed rehabilitation as the proper goal of criminal punishment. He also said the death penalty ought to be abolished. Charles Spear was the first minister of the Brewster Universalist Church. Anybody know where the Brewster Universalist Church building is today? It's the Brewster General Store, right at the end of 124 and 6A. Spear devoted his life to making things better for prisoners and to opposing the death penalty. He edited a newspaper called The Prisoner's Friend from 1845 to 1861, which stressed rehabilitation. It was an unpopular, uphill struggle, but he made some progress. In 25 years, he had virtually eliminated imprisonment for debt in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And he opened a reform school for boys in Westborough, Massachusetts. Next person I want to focus on and lift up for your consideration is Olympia Brown. Olympia Brown, as many of you will know, was the first woman ordained with full denominational support in any American denomination. She was ordained right here in our district, in Weymouth, in 1864. She had this to say on prison reform. And this, to me, distills Universalist thinking of the time. The transgressor is an experimenter who has blundered. Men think to enrich themselves, to gratify passion, to get good by wrongdoing. The transgressor finds himself confronted everywhere by the avenging spirit of a violated law. And all nature, from the shining stars above our heads to the minutest molecule under our feet, is in combination to foil his plans and to thwart his iniquitous purposes. Failure, defeat, and ruin wait for him at every corner. He is his own worst enemy, and he carries about his own condemnation with him. He is himself the principal witness, the inexorable judge, and the merciless executioner. His condition appeals to our sympathy, while his conduct calls for our condemnation. That's Universalist philosophy in a nutshell, folks. Sin, wrongdoing, occurs from the natural appetites, the natural hungers that we all have, but which go awry in some people or lead them to seek illegitimate ways to satisfy those hungers. But having transgressed, they find that sin is its own punishment. If you don't have heavens and hells, if you don't have an external system of rewards and punishment, the reward and punishment must be here in your heart. Virtue is its own reward, and sin is its own punishment. We don't have to pile on extra punishment. The last Universalist I want to lift up is Clara Barton, who, though never a member of a Universalist church, grew up Universalist in Massachusetts. She is known for her nursing work in the Civil War. After the war, she founded the American Red Cross, But at one point, on leave from her Red Cross work, Clara Barton was the superintendent of the first women's prison in Massachusetts, an institution which is still operating in Framingham. Rehabilitation was the goal of these reformers. They wanted to turn prisons into penitentiaries, a place where an offender could come to terms with the crime he or she committed and repent, reform, and emerge a useful citizen. So penitentiary comes from the word penitent. Universalists believed in a God who was not vengeful. Vengeance is not a good thing, and while it may be an emotion which arises naturally in the human breast, it should not be the basis of policy. And St. Paul, who I don't count as a universalist, but at least he said, vengeance is God's. If it's anybody's business, it's God's. It's not the human concern. From there, we're going to leap forward to 2011 and a book by Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker called The Better Angels of Our Nature. He addressed the question of whether human society has grown more violent or less over the course of human history. But in the course of this, he points out that wherever a harmful act has occurred, there are two points of view, that of the victim and that of the perpetrator. Pinker synthesizes their typical narratives. The perpetrator's narrative is as follows. The story begins with the harmful act. At the time, I had good reasons for doing it. Perhaps I was responding to an immediate provocation, or I was just reacting to the situation in a way that any reasonable person would. I had a perfect right to do what I did, and it's unfair to blame me for it. The harm was minor and easily repaired, and I apologized. It's time to get over it, put it behind us, let bygones be bygones. On the other hand, we have the victim's narrative. The story begins long before the harmful act, which was just the latest incident in a long history of mistreatment. The perpetrator's acts were incoherent, senseless, incomprehensible. The perpetrator, either that or he was an abnormal sadist, motivated only by a desire to see me suffer, though I was completely innocent. The harm he did is grievous and irreparable, with an effect that will last forever. None of us should ever forget it. You can see how those narratives build up. They're both present, arising from the act. My job as a criminal defense lawyer was to prepare the perpetrator's narrative, just as the prosecutor's job was to prepare the victims. But in reality, perpetrator and victim are roles. Each of us who lives in this world commits harmful acts, and each of us has harmful acts committed on us. One of the reasons why the prisons are so full is that we have evolved a way of dealing with crime in which imprisonment becomes a kind of foregone conclusion. Pinker's thesis in his 2011 book is that violence has decreased over human history, and that we are a less violent society than societies in the past because we have given the state a monopoly on violence. Think back to feudalism. Feudalism was a war of all against all. There was very little law. Or the Wild West, same idea. Without a state monopoly on violence, people erect castles to keep themselves safe from the other warring people in the society. And when there were court systems, the first court systems treated crimes as private matters. In English law, the victim's family in a murder situation could choose a fine or imprisonment or death as the punishment. It was up to the victim's family to decide what the punishment was going to be. Now we have crimes prosecuted in the name of all of us. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus John Doe. The People versus Jane Roe. And the public prosecutor makes the decision as to what charges to levy and what punishment to seek, and the judge decides. It is fairer and less bloody than the old feudal systems, but it's also less personal. The lawyers do the speaking. And in the average criminal case, the victim and the perpetrator never meet one another, never exchange words. This came home to me in my only death penalty case to go to execution. As I had talked to my client the night before the execution, he expressed to me some remorse for the crime, which I wanted to convey to the family of the victim. Unfortunately, even at that late stage, the system worked to prevent that communication. The guards ushered the family of the victim out of the death house immediately after the execution and did not give me a chance to address them. There is a movement in the last 2 decades which tries to set up communications between perpetrator and victim. It is called restorative justice, and it is being used by some court systems to try to resolve juvenile cases and less serious crimes without resort to jail sentences. Jesus preached loving one's enemies, turning the other cheek, going the extra mile. This is hard to do, humanly. The urge to return hurt for hurt is very strong. When you're angry, you will do almost anything. No one outside of a harmful event can require the victim to entertain forgiveness. Forgiveness is something which has to spring up from within. But a justice system worthy of the name should not set up barriers to forgiveness. If we would like to see the prisons torn down, or at least used less often, we'll have to confront some tough issues. Would we like to give the judges back the discretion they used to have to craft a sentence tailored to the individual case, even if that meant that there were people serving radically different sentences for the same crime? Are we willing to put more money into personnel costs for probation and parole officers to monitor offenders on the outside? Are we willing to risk raising the crime rate or the recidivism rate? What are we willing to risk to tear down a dehumanizing system? The recent article in The Atlantic that I referred to earlier puts a different spin on our prison industrial complex, pointing out its effect on the balance of political power. The majority of prisoners serving time have their voting rights taken away. Many of them will never be able to regain them. The 14th Amendment was supposed to protect the right to vote, but it had a hole in it. In the first section, it says that the right to vote will be granted to all people. But the second section allows them to suspend that for those who participated in the rebellion or other crimes. Now, after the Civil War, you can see the design of this. You had to disenfranchise the former Confederates, because if you didn't, they would immediately reassert majority power in their states, reenact slavery, and commence oppressing the black population. But the exception for crime, fairly read, should refer to crimes like rebellion or treason. Unfortunately, it has now been extended to encompass any ordinary crime. So paradoxically, the measure meant to protect blacks has ended up disenfranchising them. A 1974 Supreme Court case, Richardson versus Ramirez, confirms this. Prisoners are counted as persons for apportionment purposes, so the districts get more representation. But the prisoners themselves cannot vote. No wonder that conservative politicians fall all over themselves to have prison complexes built in their districts They have increased their power by having more people aggregated to their base, but those people cannot vote against them. The article goes on to say, quote, "The negative impact of this 1974 Supreme Court case on African American voting was vast and immediate. By the year 2000, 1.8 million African Americans had been barred from the polls because so many felon disenfranchisement laws had been passed in states across the country after 1974. You may remember the election of 2000. It was somewhat in the balance. Not only were their votes not counted in that year's hotly contested presidential elections, but by the next presidential elections, a full 10 states, according to the Sentencing Project, had African American disenfranchisement rates above 15%, which clearly affected the outcome of that contest as well. Further, by 2006, 48 out of 50 states had passed disenfranchisement laws, and with more than 47 million Americans, 1/4 of the adult population, having criminal records by that year, the nation's political process had been fundamentally altered. By 2011, 23.3% of African Americans in Florida, 18.3% of the black population of Wyoming, and 20.4% of African Americans in Virginia were barred from the ballot. Into popular thinking, crime is evil. But St. Paul, channeling Jesus, admonishes us not to return evil for evil. Our Universalist forebears fought to reform the prison systems of their day. Let us continue their work, finding different ways to deal with offenses that do not dehumanize the offender. Nelson Mandela, whom we honor today, went to prison for a cause he believed in and to which he had devoted his life. The hymn we sang earlier calls on God to give us courage not to be bitter. Mandela miraculously emerged from 27 years in prison without bitterness. And it was this strength of spirit which enabled him to go on to negotiate a largely peaceful end to the apartheid system that had oppressed South Africans for generations. But the average American prisoner is no Nelson Mandela. And what they learn in their sentences are how to commit crimes, bitterness, and degradation. The legacy of our American Gulag is not only political distortion and huge drain on our resources, but broken spirits and shattered lives. Now some will say, of course, the crimes created broken spirits and shattered lives. And of course crime victims can have their lives shattered by the crime. But the shattering of the offender's life, unfortunately, does not restore the victim. Let us follow in the steps of our Universalist forebears. Support restorative justice and take retribution out of our system. Support programs to rehabilitate the convict and reintegrate him or her into society. In the words of St. Paul, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. If your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Amen.